If recipes start with ingredients, what do they end with? Food. Food is the end product of pretty much any self-respecting recipe. Ingredients go in, a bunch of stuff happens, and food comes out. Food is the output of the cooking process. Okay, we've spoken about the input, that's the ingredients, and the output, that's the food. Let's focus for a second on the recipe itself. At heart, a recipe is simply a set of instructions. These are the steps that we've got to undertake to transform the input, that's the ingredients, into the output. And who's the we that's doing the transformation? That's the cook or the chef. In effect, the recipe is a set of commands or instructions that the cook has got to follow. Check out this bit of the recipe, which says that if you're counting calories, you can substitute egg whites for one or more of the whole eggs. In fact, these are pretty common. Recipes often vary their instructions based on conditions. If condition X is satisfied, then do Y, else do Z. Conditionals or if-else tests are important in recipes and in coding because everything involves judgment. Let's look at this next bit of the recipe, which tells us to heat some butter. As soon as the butter starts to bubble, we've got to pour in the egg mixture. This again is pretty common. Recipes often ask the cook to do something until a certain condition is satisfied or for every ingredient in a set of ingredients. Do something while something else is happening, or do something for every one of some other things. While and for. These are important concepts in recipes. They are also important concepts in coding. While loops and for loops. Loops help us do the same thing a bunch of times. Moving on, check out this line, which exhorts us to crack the eggs into a bowl that's deep enough to support vigorous whisking. Like anyone who's done any serious cooking, you know how much of a nightmare the pots and pans get to be the day after. Recipes are always asking the cook to put stuff in containers. Now, here's a crucial little thing to note. When the cook does something to a container, he's actually doing something to the contents of the container. Also, what's in the container keeps changing. It varies, it's variable. This in turn ties containers to an important concept in coding, that of variables. Assigning values to variables is exactly analogous to putting stuff into containers. Let's stick with this analogy, even if it's getting a little bit long in the tooth. We're almost there. Cooking involves a cook choosing a recipe and then carrying out the instructions in that recipe in a kitchen. Coding involves a programmer creating a program, then running its commands on a computer. Coding is like cooking, the programmer is like the cook or the chef, the code is like the recipe. Cooking involves taking in ingredients, applying instructions, and producing food. Coding involves taking inputs, applying commands, and producing output. Inputs are like ingredients, processing is like the cooking process, and output is like the food that we get at the end of a recipe. Recipes often involve checking stuff, checking conditions, and then changing what needs to be done accordingly. Programs also often involve testing stuff, testing conditions, and then changing what needs to be done accordingly. Using judgment to evaluate conditions is important both in cooking and in coding. Recipes often involve doing the same thing a bunch of times or until some condition is satisfied. Similarly, programs and coding often involve doing the same thing a bunch of times or until a condition is satisfied. For loops and while loops are essential parts of programming, just like they are of cooking. While cooking, you keep putting stuff in containers. While coding, you assign values to variables. When you heat a container, you're actually heating what's in the container. Similarly, when you do something to a variable, you're actually doing that to the value that's assigned to the variable. What's in a container changes as you put stuff in or take stuff out. What's in a variable changes as you assign different values to it or do things to what's in the variable. Now, if you think about it, every step in a recipe subjects the ingredients to some transformation. Every step has some function. It takes in an ingredient, processes it, and then what comes out of that step feeds into the next step of the recipe. Now, there's a technical term for something which takes some stuff in, applies a transformation to process the input, and outputs something. That technical term is a function. Functions are important parts of computer programming. Functions, like steps in a recipe, are transformations of inputs into outputs. Cooking is thus a lot like coding. The parallel is complete.